interview, interrogation, confession side, a little bit more on the legal end. Because I think a lot of times, showing you some of these pictures here, this is what we see on TV. And, everybody's got their favorite police show, etc., whether it's Law and Order or whatever. And a lot of times the interviews, the interrogations, sometimes they're kind of close to what we do, and really sometimes they're not. But I think we take a lot away from, excuse me, from what, kind of TV is or shows. So I want to give you some definitions on a couple of things that are important, because you're going to have to know what these are. So the first would be an admission. So what is an admission? Well, this is a person that admits a fact that tends to establish guilt. So an admission isn't the same exact thing as a confession, right? So an admission, again, admits a fact that tends to establish guilt. Yes, I was there at the scene of the robbery. Yes, I was there at the scene of a shooting. It's an admission, but it's not quite a confession, right? A confession is going to be just a little bit more, and we'll kind of look at that, all right? The confession part is going to be where the person actually acknowledges the commission of a crime in response to the questioning that you do, or they may voluntarily approach you and say that they did something. That would be a confession. So that's the difference between an admission and a confession. So we just want to make sure that we're kind of clear on that. A statement that somebody gives is a little bit different. It can be oral or written, and it's basically a declaration to law enforcement in which an individual may assert their innocence. They're going to give a statement. I wasn't at the scene of the crime. I wasn't there. I didn't do it, etc. So that's more of a statement. Okay. So let me give you an example of kind of a confession, if you will, and you can kind of look at it. And this is based off of a case. So on August 18th, 1983, and this is a while ago, but it holds true today. Officer Anderson, who was working for Denver PD, was in uniform, working in an off-duty capacity in downtown Denver. A lot of times you'll get off-duty law enforcement that are allowed to wear their uniform, working off-duty at a certain part of a city, etc. And this person ended up approaching the officer by the name of Francis Conley, approached Anderson, and without any prompting at all, he told the officer that he killed someone, and he wanted to talk about it. Now, it doesn't happen often. That's actually kind of I can't remember the time when anybody walked up to me and said, "Hey, Farrar, guess what? I killed someone." It doesn't really happen like that, but you can imagine the officer's kind of surprised, right? He's a little bit confused. So the officer basically asked him a few questions, which would be, I would do the same thing. And so he asked him a couple questions. And so Conley told Anderson that in the past he'd been a patient in several mental hospitals. And to Anderson, this guy seemed normal and fully able to understand the nature of his act. So they passed it off to a homicide detective who took over the case and basically read Conley his rights, which would be appropriate to do, right? You're going to interrogate this person because he said he did something, so that probably would be a good thing to do. And he was also able to confirm later that there was in fact a murder victim that matched the story given by this guy. So you're kind of thinking, things are kind of adding up a little bit. And on top of that, Conley ended up taking the detective and the officer to the crime scene. And throughout the investigation, there really was no indication at all that this guy Conley was suffering from any type of mental illness. Now, later on, during an interview by the public defender, because he had the right to an attorney, etc., he becomes a little bit disoriented and began to hear voices. And so at the preliminary hearing, when he goes to court, and at this preliminary hearing, Conley's attorney moved to suppress all of the statements that he had given to the officers. Now, why do you guys think he did that?
Is that because the confession was like the biggest portion of the case and pretty much everything hinged off of the confession?
That's one point. So that's good, Dale. Yeah. I mean, that it really is right now. I mean, well, they did find a crime scene, but you're right. A lot of things, getting them to the crime scene, all of that stuff was part of the confession. What else do you think kind of came into play here?
It can change like the course of the case, so he may not end up going to jail. They'll put him in a like a psych ward.
Ah, so the psych part. Okay, so that's kind of what I was hoping somebody would get to. Remember earlier he told the officer that he had been in a mental hospital, but they kind of thought he was like, hey, everything's fine, and we even found this corroborating thing and this and that. So it kind of rested on the fact, hey, I put now what? Well, they ended up bringing in a psychiatrist employed by a local hospital who testified that this person, Conley, was suffering from schizophrenia and basically had a psychotic episode at, the day before his confession. And the doctor testified that in his expert opinion, this person was suffering from hallucinations, etc., which basically kind of interfered, if you will, with the respondent's ability to make rational choice. So the fact that he was a mental patient and going through psychotic episodes, when the officer Mirandized him, the court kind of found, hey, you know what? This person may not have been able to understand what he was actually saying, or understand that everything, that he was going to say could be used against him in a court of law. So a super interesting case that kind of comes to mind on this one here. So at the end of the day, the issue in this case really comes down to, were the statements by the person voluntary? And you could probably argue, well, yeah, the officer didn't coerce him, but is there something to be said with the fact that he was a mental patient? And if you're thinking in your head, maybe, the answer is yeah, probably. Were the statements, involuntary, meaning he didn't know what he was doing? He didn't realize the consequences of basically admitting what he did. Does it matter that the suspect might have had a mental illness? On the law enforcement side, you're probably going, well, who cares? But really, the court's going to kind of go, well, maybe it does matter that this person he didn't have the capacity to understand what he was giving up, if that kind of makes any sense, right? And the officers didn't coerce the suspect, so that should be enough to show his statement was voluntary. But again, the mental illness comes into play. So just a super interesting case. And if you want to kind of look at another case, and we won't look at it tonight just for sake of time, would be the Menendez trial. Another really interesting case as it relates to statements, interview, interrogations, etc. Okay, so as we kind of move into this chapter, there was a professor by the name of Fred Inbow of Northwestern University, and he kind of goes on to say that there's a significant influence on the tactics and strategy of police interrogations. And he basically argued that throughout his career, detective novels, films, and TV had kind of misled the public into believing that police solve most crimes by scientific evidence, because we all watch CSI and all those kind of cool programs, or even eyewitness identifications. But the fact of the matter is, most investigations, a lot of the information is going to come from statements that you get from a person involved in the crime. So here's kind of an example. You discover the body of a dead female who appears to have been the victim of an assault. There's absolutely no indication of forced entry into her house. The police investigation fails to yield DNA, fingerprints, clothing fibers, or witnesses. You have absolutely nothing. And police question everyone who may have had a motive to kill the victim, including the victim's former angry husband and her brother-in-law, who had quite a bit of gambling debt and owed the victim money. So now what would you do? Where would you go from here? You have absolutely no physical evidence.
I would canvass the area and talk to neighbors and anybody who might have seen something or somebody entering her apartment at the time, her place of residence at the time of her death.
Okay, that's one.
There,
That's definitely one thing to do. What else?
You start checking phone records.
Okay, that's good. What else?
I would talk to the angry husband.
The angry husband. Okay, so they did. They talked to the angry husband, and they also talked to, the brother-in-law who had quite a bit of gambling debt. So I mean, you really don't have any physical evidence. So in your mind now, you're starting to figure out, okay, I gotta canvas, I gotta use records, databases, all these other things we kind of talked about. We gotta start interviewing people. In this particular case here, the brother-in-law eventually tires under police questioning and ends up confessing. So kind of what I'm getting at is this example illustrates some really important points as it relates to confessions. Many criminal cases can only be solved, only through confessions or information that are obtained from others. Suspects often will not admit their guilt unless they're subjected to a longer interrogation. Because if you walk into an interview or an interrogation, you go, okay, we've got this evidence here. Did you do it? And they say, no. Are you just going to get up and walk out? I mean, that's so the longer the interrogation goes, the more chance you have of actually getting to somebody to admit. And then finally, successful police questioning requires sophisticated interrogation techniques that may be considered a little bit of trickery, kind of like what I did, right? Or even manipulative in ordinary police interactions with the public. So sometimes we have to be a little bit creative. This is the case that I was kind of talking about before. So this is what a driver's license printout looks like. It would have the person's name, okay, and I kind of took that out so you couldn't see it, but it would have their address, their name, etc., all this stuff here, and my fingerprint. This is what I showed the person. And yeah, it's trickery, all right, and it's super official because it is a printout, but it did kind of work. So in this particular, it's kind of a close-up picture of what it would look like that I handed him. So, when we talk about confessions, know that there's no reliable data that clearly establish, the percentage of cases in which interrogations play this central role in establishing someone's guilt. But we can only note that jurors credit confessions with a great deal of importance in the determination of a defendant's guilt or innocence. So if somebody admits to doing something, that's a big plus for your case as a law enforcement officer versus if somebody doesn't admit. And that's kind of common sense, right? You have a better case if somebody admits to doing something. So getting these confessions really kind of holds water. And we talked a little bit earlier about, hey, remember to record or videotape the confession so that way the person can't backtrack later on and change their mind. Okay, let me see. Okay, so some of the importance in the criminal justice process as it relates to confessions. Well, one would be kind of obvious: crime detection. Confessions help solve crimes in the absence of evidence. If you get someone to confess, now you need corroboration, but in the absence of scientific evidence or even good witnesses, that confession is going to help. They also say that confessions kind of aid in accountability, meaning that it's a step towards rehabilitation for an offender. It's not always the case, but it is noted. And then also efficiency, meaning that if you get a confession, chances are it's going to facilitate that criminal conviction, meaning things are going to be more efficient. The person might even take a plea bargain, right? And that's where you make a deal with between the two attorneys, so you don't have to go through this long, drawn-out trial. So that's another real important thing about getting a confession. I mean, and even if you go back a little bit, and this was a while ago, but everybody remembers the O.J. Simpson case, right? Probably one of the best case studies as it relates to, prosecution, defense, etc. But it's estimated that the prosecution's case really topped $9 million. So if they could have got a confession and maybe a plea deal or whatever, it really, you could see the amount of money that it would have saved, right? And this number includes, the DAs, the assistant attorneys, the court costs, the judge, reporters, sequestering of the jury, sheriff's deputies, etc., and his 473 days in jail at that particular time for this case. And things have kind of only gotten, more costly, if you will. But we also know that confessions present challenges and some problems. We know that can really happen, right? And some of the potential challenges, now these are a little bit out of the ordinary. I like to kind of shock you. A couple of you went, oh my gosh, when you looked at the picture on the left. Okay, that doesn't happen, or at least I've never seen it happen. It's a photo that I found, but I wanted to kind of wake you up a little bit. But the challenges for confessions could be abuse. I'm not going to say that it's never happened, because I was a cop for 34 years. And I know, especially before my time, law enforcement could be abusive. And it was okay back then, but it's certainly not okay. And it's certainly not okay now, right? And so we know that law enforcement could be tempted to use coercion or similar tactics to get confessions. And so we don't want to turn a blind eye to that. So we know that there could be challenges as it relates to confessions because people are human and people could abuse the system, right? We also know that there could be an issue with fair procedure. We talk about a reliance on pretrial confessions to establish a suspect's guilt is really contrary to the principle that guilt is to be established beyond a reasonable doubt through the courtroom. This is just a challenge. We know that reliability could be a challenge. There's a danger that a conviction will be based on a false confession. Do people confess to things that they don't do? The answer is going to be yes. And I see some of you shaking your head. Absolutely they do, for different reasons. And we'll look at some of those as we kind of go down. Inequality could be a challenge, right? Disadvantaged suspects, lacking in self-confidence, may be more vulnerable to trickery or manipulation. In addition, those who have money can hire their own attorneys, right? Those who don't, you get a public defender. Now, it doesn't mean that a public defender is bad, but a high-priced group of attorneys like Mr. Simpson had versus a public defender that might have 60 cases on his or her caseload, you know which one is going to put more time and effort into your case. So this could be an issue. There could be an inequality type issue, right? Okay. And I threw that picture in for fun. Again, just to kind of show you, we don't do these things. Back in the old days, I remember watching these old movies where they shined the light in someone's face and said something like, "Where were you on the night of the 31st?" I'm sure that probably happened back then, way, way before my time. But we do have to understand that there are issues. And we have false confessions. The threat of false confessions and convictions really has been kind of concerning. And it calls into question the adequacy of the protections that are made available to defendants when they go through this particular criminal justice process. And it's pointed to by critics as illustrating the lack of fairness in the criminal justice system. Not everybody gets the same type of representation. Okay, and I think we know that. If you have money, you can get your own attorney. If you don't, you're not going to get your own attorney. And, that kind of calls into question what's fair. I'm not going to play these videos for lack of time. I'll let you go through them. You can go back and you can click on them. But there's a couple of different videos. One deals with Miranda with kids. The other deals with Miranda, where the investigator pushes a little bit too hard and kind of coerces things. And then you have a false confession video of a youngster. And kids are a little bit different, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Staying with false confessions really quick, individuals that are basically isolated in an interrogation room have been known to make false confession, even in those instances where the police didn't pressure or manipulate them, and treated the suspect in a balanced, respectful fashion because they were just left in a room for a while. This is another good case study, if you want to take the time, would be the Norfolk Four. They all admitted to committing a crime that they didn't commit. And so, again, another really good case study. This is another one. Okay, the Central Park rapist case. There's a couple of videos and an article. They even made a movie about it, where these individuals were juveniles and they were basically pressured into, they didn't understand what their rights were. And they ended up, the interrogations were like, 12, 13, 14 hours long. And that's just way too much, right? So there are issues with these kinds of things. I mean, even at your ages right now, you're all college students. You have the, I'll tell when you read someone their rights, you have the right to remain silent. Okay, we probably understand that part. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. Anything? I mean, so imagine if you're like 14 or 13 or 12 and someone's reading this to you. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed by the court. I mean, these are things that those kids probably don't understand what rights they're actually giving up. So these are some of the problems that we face. So
There's actually a show based on that case. I've seen the entire thing, and then they have like an after show where all of the kids come out and speak. Well, they're adults by that time.
right, and I think I know the one you're talking about. And so there's some factors that kind of go with that. And thanks for bringing that up. They frame it as police bias, but really law enforcement in this particular case, they were pressured to solve the case. It doesn't make what they did right. This is one of the issues. The age and intelligence of young people. Okay, they're easier to trick or manipulate, so you have to be careful of, right? Or they didn't understand. A lot of misleading remarks and things like that. Hey, you know what? If you would tell me what you did, I'll let you go home. Well, if you were interrogated for 28 hours, if you were like 12 years old, wouldn't you tell the person whatever they wanted to hear just so you could go home? You might if you're only 12 years old. So these are all these things that kind of come out when it comes to false confession. So you have to be very, very careful, especially when you're dealing with kids. And kind of an interesting study, there was a police accountability task force that was kind of formed in Chicago. And it was basically of arrests in Chicago in 2014 and 2015. And this is really kind of not good. It found that less than 1% of all arrestees, adult and juveniles, had the assistance of an attorney during their interrogation. So do you think not having an attorney really, 1% not having an attorney, that's really bad, right? So, these are things that we really can't get into. So we have to be careful, right? So false confessions, understand also that they are a very small percentage of all confessions obtained by law enforcement. Again, though, these confessions may result in the conviction of an innocent person and undermine our entire criminal justice system. So we have to be kind of careful. And they even categorize types. So I wanted to kind of give you a little understanding of kind of some types. So they have what they call voluntary false confessors. And these are people that basically they want the publicity, or they feel guilty for a past crime, or they could be mentally challenged, like when we talked about that one case law, or that one case with the guy that ran up and admitted that he committed a homicide. They have what they call compliant false confessors. And these are individuals that confess because they want some favorable consideration at sentencing. Okay, so if they confess, maybe the judge will be more lenient on their sentencing. And then they have internalized false confessors. And these are ones that basically accept the version of law enforcement, or they fail a lie detector test, and they kind of actually at some point believe that they may have committed that particular crime. So these are all the different kind of types of false confessors. And when we talk about compliant ones, we have to be careful again, and I'll give you just a quick example so we can kind of move on. Imagine if you were in kind of an instance where you're detained for something. Let's say it's a robbery case, and the officer gets with the detective, they get with the DA, and they say, hey, look, if we go to trial on this case, you could be looking at 10 years in prison. But if you admit that you committed this crime, we'll give you 2 years. And in law enforcement world, we call this a 50-50. It's kind of a roll of the dice, right? You don't want to admit to something that you didn't do, but if you go to trial and lose, you could spend 10 years in prison. But if you take the 2 years, you could be out in less than a year. So do you think that some people might take the deal even though they didn't commit the crime? The answer is going to be yes, that somebody might actually do that, which is really a shame if they didn't do it. So hopefully that just kind of makes sense. And that's why we want to be able to at least understand why some people do what they do. Okay. And I'll skip the example of Eddie Joe Lloyd, but this is an individual that did the exact same thing. He admitted it. He even wrote out a statement, and it turned out that he didn't do what they said. Okay. He was under medication and some different things, and he actually was freed later on through DNA. Okay. So there are some limitations on police interrogations. Note that the judiciary has relied on 3 constitutional provisions to ensure that confessions are fair. The Fourth Amendment, which is due process, or the 14th Amendment, sorry, which is due process. The Fifth Amendment, which is self-incrimination, and the Sixth Amendment, right to counsel. So, I mean, these are all put in place to ensure that there's a fair process, but also understand that if somebody wants to talk to you after Miranda, that they're going to be waiving some of these. So you can kind of see the importance of it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on some of the kind of the ins and outs of due process. I did put a couple cases in here that you could look up if you wanted to, that talks about law enforcement using what they call the third degree, which is coercion, physical coercion, or even psychological coercion. So those are some things just down the road. If you want to kind of look into those, you can. Understand the Supreme Court basically asserts the aim of voluntariness, is not only to exclude false convictions, but to ensure this fairness when it comes to obtaining confessions. And fairness means that the methods that you use can't be contrary to the criminal justice system. So we can't waterboard people or, use electrodes or any of that stuff that you've seen on the movies and things like that. I put in a couple of case laws that you can look at. And again, you don't have to know all the case laws, but know that a lot of, this part we're looking at now is more of the kind of cases that base some of this. So we have this case Spano versus New York that tells us, hey, law enforcement, the methods that they use, we have to obey the law while we enforce it. So we have to have this fairness thing. We can't coerce people. Okay. So we've got a lot of different things. There's a case, Townsend versus Sane, that says that, you know, a confession is basically null and void if it's the result of a mental disability or drugs. So we have to be careful of those as well as we kind of, go through this. We also know that the Supreme Court has held that to be admissible into evidence, a confession has to be freely, voluntarily, and without compulsion. Okay, so we can't coerce you into making a confession. Okay, so there's a lot of different things that kind of come into there. So kind of in summary, the due process for voluntariness is designed to achieve, the trustworthiness, the fundamental fairness, police methods, and free will, and what they call rational choice. All right. So a couple other things I want to hit on before we're done tonight, and one of them falls under voluntariness. Note that the prosecution bears the burden of establishing a voluntary confession, and it's based on what they call the preponderance of evidence, and the courts look at several factors to determine whether or not somebody voluntarily confessed. They'll look at if there was any physical abuse, was there any psychological abuse, was it an interrogation, did they have the right to an attorney, was there, a necessity for what the officers did? So they're going to look at all of these different things here. Okay. Kind of go a little bit further down here. I'm not going to spend time on the actual case laws. I'll let you kind of go through those at your leisure. We talked a little bit about Miranda. Here is my actual Miranda card that I carried with me. It's kind of crumpled up a little bit. But remember, Miranda, as we've seen, supplemented kind of the due process voluntariness test by requiring that police read people subjected to custodial interrogation their Miranda warnings. So this would be the Miranda card that you could read to them. Remember, it's based on the case Miranda versus Arizona. And I'm going to go through this part right here. Again, Miranda warnings are triggered when there's a person is in custody and they're being interrogated. That's all you have to remember. Let's see. I have a couple. I think I'm going to be really close. I don't want to spend too much time on the legal part. There is what we call a public safety exception to Miranda, just so you know. It's a very narrow exception. It's based on a case law called New York versus Quarles. And basically it's based on protection of the public. And an example could be if suspects were running from law enforcement, and let's say that they threw a gun over a fence into somebody's backyard, and you caught up to the suspect and they didn't have the gun with them that they had a minute ago, you could ask them where the gun is, but that's all you can ask them. You can't ask them about the case that they robbed somebody or whatever. It's based on public safety, because what we don't want to have happen is some kid pick up that handgun and shoot themselves. So if we're questioning an individual outside of Miranda under the public safety exception, okay, that's okay. But anything else, we're going to have to read them their Miranda rights. All right, I think we're probably close without having to go into all of this other information. A lot of this you can kind of go back and look at on your own. Let's see. All right, I think we're probably pretty good. All right, so any questions really on when somebody needs to be advised of their Miranda rights, interview and interrogations, what a statement is, kind of some of the things that, a lot of these are just case laws, so I'm not going to spend the time, waste your time on the case laws. And if you want to look, I had a couple other videos that were posted in your Canvas as well. This is, again, probably one of the best cases that I think if you want to take a look at as far as interview and interrogation would be the Russell William case. But with that